Canada's fighter jet fight is now about the aircraft that will protect your skies, your taxes, and your country's place beside the United States for the next 40 years. You were told this was a simple choice between the Swedish Gripen and the American F-35, but the real choice is between political control and combat survival. And the reason Canada walked away from the Gripen, after all the jobs and sovereignty promises, says something much bigger about where North American defense is heading. The aircraft that looks easier to buy is not always the aircraft that keeps pilots alive. And the documents, delays, and sudden 2025 review reveal why Ottawa is still trapped between national pride and military reality. For more than 15 years, Canada has been trying to answer one question that should have been settled long ago. What replaces the CF-18? That sounds like a defense procurement question. It is not. It is a sovereignty question. It is a money question. It is a jobs question. It is a trust question. And in 2026, it has become one of the clearest tests of whether Canada wants to remain tightly locked into the American defense system, or whether Ottawa wants to build a wider, more independent path with Europe, Sweden, Britain, Japan, and other allies. But here's the hard part. Canada can want independence. Canada can want jobs. Canada can want assembly lines in Quebec, aerospace work in Montreal, more control over mission data, and less dependence on Washington. But when a fighter jet is flying over the Arctic, when a Russian bomber is approaching the edge of North American airspace, when NORAD needs real-time information, and when Canadian pilots may have to operate beside American, Norwegian, Danish, British, or other allied aircraft, the politics become smaller. The mission becomes everything. That is why the Saab Gripen became politically attractive. And that is also why the F-35 remained the aircraft Canada's military system kept coming back to. The public story began with anger over cost. The deeper story began with delay. Canada's CF-18s are not just old aircraft. They are aircraft from another era. They entered service in the early 1980s, when the Cold War looked different, when the Arctic threat looked different, when China was not the same military power, and when fighter jets were not flying computers connected to satellites, radars, drones, command centers, and allied networks. Canada knew for years that the CF-18 fleet had to be replaced, but the replacement process became one of the longest defense dramas in modern Canadian politics. First came the early F-35 decision, then came political backlash, then came questions over cost, then came a reset, then came new competitions, new promises, new delays, and new pressure from allies who needed Canada to modernize faster. By January 2023, Ottawa finally announced that Canada would acquire 88 F-35A fighter jets through an agreement with the United States government, Lockheed Martin, and Pratt & Whitney. The Canadian government described it as the biggest Royal Canadian Air Force investment in more than 30 years, with aircraft, equipment, weapons, infrastructure, training, software support, and sustainment all tied into the package. That should have ended the debate. It did not. Because in March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney ordered a review of the F-35 purchase. The reason was not simply the aircraft. The reason was dependence. Carney said Canada was looking at alternatives because it relied too much on the United States for security, and Reuters reported that the review came during a period of serious trade tension between Ottawa and Washington. That one decision reopened the door for Saab, and Saab walked straight through it. The Gripen's argument was not stupid, it was not weak, it was not laughable. In many ways, it was exactly the kind of argument Canadian voters were ready to hear. Lower cost, easier maintenance, a fighter designed to operate from rougher conditions, a smaller logistical footprint, more Canadian work, more Canadian control, more local industry, less dependence on the United States. And at a moment when US-Canada tensions were rising, that mattered. Saab's pitch reached far beyond the cockpit. The company had long presented the Gripen as a made-in-Canada fighter option, promising Canadian jobs, industrial offsets, technology transfer, and Canadian aerospace benefits. Saab's own Canadian offer said the Gripen program could create 6,000 direct jobs across Canada over 40 years, with intellectual property transfer and full offset commitments. Then the political opening grew even wider. In late 2025, Reuters reported that Saab was in talks with Canada and Bombardier about potentially building Gripen jets under license in Canada, with Saab's chief executive pointing to a possible 10,000 jobs. Bombardier said it was open to contributing local expertise if Ottawa chose that path. For any Canadian Prime Minister looking at defense sovereignty, that is a powerful offer. Not just buy the jet, build part of the future at home. Not just spend money abroad, turn the purchase into Canadian aerospace work. Not just depend on Washington, create optionality. And that is why the Gripen became so attractive politically. It gave Ottawa something the F-35 could not easily give: A story. A story of Canadian workers. A story of Canadian assembly. A story of less American control. A story of a middle power refusing to be locked into one defense supplier forever. And for many Canadians, that story felt right. Because the F-35 has never been just an aircraft in Canadian politics, it has been a symbol. For supporters, it is the most advanced Allied fighter available, the aircraft Canada needs for NORAD, NATO, the Arctic, and the next generation of war. For critics, it is expensive, American-controlled, software-heavy, hard to sustain, and politically uncomfortable at a time when Canada is trying to reduce dependence on Washington. That is the tension. The Gripen offered national control. The F-35 offered military integration, and Canada needed both. But it could not get both equally in the same aircraft. This is where the public debate often gets too simple. People say, the Gripen is cheaper, so buy the Gripen. Or they say, the F-35 is stealthier, so buy the F-35. But a fighter decision is not like choosing a car. A fighter jet is part of a whole war system. It needs pilots, weapons, spare parts, simulators, hangars, classified software, secure data links, radar integration, maintenance pipelines, Allied access, upgrade paths, training standards, and political trust. A cheaper aircraft can become expensive if it forces a country to build a second system around it. A more expensive aircraft can become more valuable if it plugs directly into the defense network Canada already depends on. That is why the leaked evaluation data became so damaging to the Gripen argument. According to reporting on Radio Canada documents, the F-35 scored 57.1 out of 60, or about 95%, in Canada's fighter evaluation, while the Gripen E reportedly scored 19.8 out of 60, or about 33%. The reporting said both aircraft met mandatory requirements, but the operational scoring showed a huge gap once rated military criteria were applied. That number has to be handled carefully. It is reported evaluation data, not a public official speech from the government explaining every classified detail. But even with that caution, the direction of the story is hard to ignore. The Gripen may have been politically attractive. The F-35 appears to have been operationally dominant in the competition. That does not mean the Gripen is a bad aircraft. It is not. Sweden designed the Gripen for a very specific national defense problem. A smaller country needing a modern, flexible fighter that can operate efficiently, disperse quickly, and survive in a European security environment where cost, readiness, and national control matter. For Sweden, that makes sense. For Brazil, that made sense. For countries that need a capable, affordable, modern fighter with national industrial benefits, Gripen can be a serious option. But Canada's problem is not Sweden's problem. Canada does not only need a fighter that can take off, shoot, land, and be maintained efficiently. Canada needs a fighter that can defend one of the largest airspaces on Earth. Canada needs a fighter that can operate in the Arctic. Canada needs a fighter that can work inside NORAD, where Canadian and American air defense are deeply connected. Canada needs a fighter that can share information with Five Eyes partners. Canada needs a fighter that can survive in a future where Russia and China are building better air defenses, better missiles, better sensors, and more advanced aircraft. And Canada needs a fighter that will still matter in the 2040s. That is where the F-35 case becomes stronger. Its biggest advantage is not just stealth, although stealth matters. Its biggest advantage is that it acts like a sensor and data machine in the sky. It collects information, it fuses information, it shares information. It can see threats before older aircraft can. It can operate with other F-35s in a way that makes the whole formation smarter. And it is becoming the common fighter language of many of Canada's closest allies. Lockheed Martin's own F-35 material argues that the aircraft is interoperable with the United States for NORAD and with allies in the Arctic and NATO, including countries such as the United States, Denmark, and Norway that will operate the F-35 in northern environments. That is a company claim, so it should not be treated as neutral analysis, but it matches the core strategic argument behind Canada's decision. Integration matters. And Canada's own government says the fighter replacement is meant to help defend Canadian sovereignty and meet NORAD and NATO commitments. That is not a side issue. That is the heart of the purchase. This situation is moving fast, and most people following it are still getting the surface version. F-35 expensive, Gripen cheaper, Canada angry at Washington. Subscribers here get the full picture, what the deal means, why the military keeps leaning one way, and what could happen next if politics pulls the country in another direction. Do not settle for half the story. Because the real question is not whether Canada can buy Gripens. Of course it can. The real question is whether Canada can buy fewer F-35s, add Gripens, and still avoid creating a complicated mixed fleet that weakens readiness instead of strengthening it. That is where the split fleet idea becomes dangerous. On paper, it sounds like compromise. Buy some F-35s for stealth and NORAD integration. Buy some Gripens for cost, jobs, and sovereignty. Everybody gets something. The military gets a fifth-generation aircraft. Industry gets Canadian production. Politicians get independence from Washington. Taxpayers get told the country is saving money. But inside an air force, compromise can become a burden. A split fleet means different training pipelines, different maintenance systems, different spare parts, different simulators, different weapons integration, different software, different supply chains, different support contracts, different pilot conversion plans, different upgrades, different mission planning systems. And for a Royal Canadian Air Force that is already stretched, that is not a small problem. It is a force structure problem. Reuters reported in August 2025 that a Canadian defense review made the case for sticking with the F-35 plan, with sources saying alternatives could become costlier because of added training, logistics, and maintenance issues, especially given the close integration of Canadian and US forces. The same report noted Canada had already legally committed to buying the first 16 F-35s. That is the part many voters never see. A fighter jet is not bought once. It is operated every day. It is paid for every year. It requires trained technicians, secure facilities, classified systems, spare engines, parts inventory, software updates, weapons certification, and long-term sustainment. If Canada buys 2 aircraft types, it does not just buy 2 cockpits. It buys 2 ecosystems, and ecosystems are expensive. This is why the Gripen's political strength can become its military weakness. The very things that make the Gripen attractive, separate supply chain, non-US source, more national control, also make it harder to integrate into the North American defense structure that Canada has relied on for decades. For Canadian sovereignty, that sounds like freedom. For NORAD, it can sound like friction. And NORAD is not a theory. It is the daily defense of North American airspace. Canada and the United States do not simply cooperate in NORAD. They are fused through it. Radars, warning systems, command decisions, intercept planning, Arctic surveillance, and continental defense all depend on fast, shared information. That does not mean Canada must buy every American weapon. It does mean that when Canada buys a fighter, the aircraft has to fit into the joint defense brain that already exists. The F-35 was built to live inside that world. The Gripen can be integrated with allied systems, but it is not the same thing as joining the growing F-35 network that so many NATO and Arctic allies are adopting. That is the military case. But the political case is not dead. Because the F-35 review did not happen in a vacuum, Canada is now trying to reduce its reliance on the United States in defense procurement. AP reported that Canada became the first non-European Union country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe Defense Fund, a major EU loan initiative, as part of a broader effort to diversify defense procurement away from the United States. AP also reported that more than 70% of Canadian defense capital spending currently goes to the US. That number explains why the F-35 debate is so sensitive. This is not only about which aircraft wins a scoring table. It is about whether Canada's defense future is too dependent on one country. And for Canadian voters, that matters. If Washington is stable, friendly, predictable, and fully aligned with Ottawa, dependence feels manageable. But if Washington becomes more aggressive on trade, more transactional on alliances, or more willing to pressure Canada in public, then dependence starts to feel like vulnerability. That is why Gripen's pitch landed. It arrived at the exact moment Canada was asking a bigger question. Can we defend ourselves with American equipment while also protecting ourselves from American pressure? That is not an anti-American question. It is a sovereignty question. And it is a question every serious middle power has to ask. But the answer cannot be emotional. It has to survive contact with reality. If the Gripen does not meet Canada's highest operational needs as well as the F-35, then buying it mainly to send a political message could create a deeper problem. Canada could gain symbolic independence while losing combat advantage. And that trade is not simple. For American viewers, this story matters because Canada is not a distant ally. Canada is part of the defense of the same continent. If Canadian fighter capability is delayed, reduced, or made less integrated, the United States does not stay untouched. The Arctic is becoming more important. Russian long-range aviation still matters. Chinese military reach is expanding. Missile threats are changing. And North America's northern approaches are no longer a sleepy backwater on the map. If Canada's fighter decision weakens NORAD readiness, then American taxpayers, American pilots, and American defense planners may end up carrying more of the burden. That is the uncomfortable part. A Canadian procurement delay can become an American defense problem. And for Canadian viewers, the reverse is also true. If Canada chooses an aircraft mainly because Washington wants it, then Ottawa risks looking like it cannot make its own strategic decisions. That damages public trust. It feeds the feeling that Canada is paying billions for a system it does not fully control. It makes defense policy feel like dependency, not sovereignty. So Canada is stuck between two fears. One fear says, if we buy the F-35, we become too dependent on the United States. The other fear says, if we walk away from the F-35, we weaken the very defense network that protects us. That is the fighter debate in one sentence, and that is why the Gripen lost ground despite having such a strong political sales pitch. It solved one Canadian problem, but not necessarily the most dangerous one. The cost issue makes this even harder. In June 2025, Reuters reported that Canada's Auditor General said the cost of the planned F-35 fleet was expected to rise sharply from the original estimate, with projected costs reaching between $27.7 billion and $33.2 billion. The report pointed to factors including foreign exchange and facility expenses, along with risks such as pilot shortages and delays in specialized infrastructure. That is not a minor headache. That is a political weapon. Every time the F-35 cost rises, Gripen becomes easier to sell. Every time the F-35 needs more infrastructure, Gripen becomes easier to sell. Every time Canadians hear that software, parts, upgrades, and sustainment are tied to American systems, Gripen becomes easier to sell. But cheaper does not automatically mean better. The real price of a fighter is not only the contract. The real price is what happens if it cannot do the mission Canada needs it to do. A cheaper aircraft that cannot survive the hardest fight may be too expensive in the only moment that matters. A more expensive aircraft that sits in hangars because the country lacks pilots, facilities, or sustainment discipline is also a failure. So the debate cannot be reduced to F-35 good, Gripen bad. That is lazy. The honest answer is harder. Gripen is a serious aircraft with a serious industrial offer. F-35 is a more advanced combat system with a stronger fit for Canada's NORAD, Arctic, NATO, and fifth-generation warfare requirements. That is why Canada did not simply walk away from Gripen because it was useless. Canada walked away because the military problem was bigger than the political promise. Do you think Canada should prioritize sovereignty and jobs even if the aircraft is less integrated with NORAD? Or should combat capability come first even if that means deeper dependence on the United States? That question is not theoretical anymore, because as of April 2026, Canada's F-35 review was still not fully resolved. Reuters reported that Defense Minister David McGuinty said Canada was still reviewing the plan to buy 88 F-35s and that Ottawa could also purchase some foreign aircraft. That means the issue is still alive, not as a social media argument, not as old procurement history, as a current strategic decision. And there is another layer now, GCAP. The Global Combat Air Program, led by Britain, Japan, and Italy, is meant to develop a next-generation fighter for the 2030s. Reuters reported that GCAP is an effort to build a next-generation fighter by 2035, led by major industry players in Japan, Britain, and Italy. Canada's interest in GCAP changes the frame, because Ottawa may be trying to solve two problems at once. The first problem is immediate, replacing the CF-18 with a fifth-generation aircraft that can work with NORAD and NATO now. The second problem is future-facing, making sure Canada is not locked out of sixth-generation fighter technology later. That is a much smarter strategy than simply saying yes or no to the F-35. Canada could decide that the F-35 is the necessary bridge for the next 20 years, while GCAP or another future program becomes the sovereignty play for the decades after that. In other words, Ottawa may not need to choose between military reality and industrial independence in one aircraft. It may need to sequence them. F-35 for today's integrated air defense problem, GCAP or another future partnership for tomorrow's industrial and technological independence. That kind of strategy would not satisfy everyone. Gripen supporters would say Canada missed a chance to build more at home now. F-35 supporters would say Canada should stop delaying and fully commit. Budget hawks would say the country is about to spend tens of billions in a system already under pressure. Defense planners would say the longer the political debate continues, the harder it becomes to transition from the CF-18 safely and on schedule. and all of them would have a point. That is why this story is so messy. It is not because Canada cannot make decisions. It is because every decision creates a real cost. Cancel too much of the F-35 deal, and Canada risks losing capability, integration, and schedule. Keep the full F-35 deal, and Canada risks deepening dependence on the US defense industry at the exact moment Ottawa is trying to diversify. Split the fleet, and Canada risks building a more complicated air force than it can easily sustain. Wait for sixth-generation options, and Canada risks leaving a dangerous gap in the 2030s. Choose Gripen for politics, and Canada may not get the same combat advantage. Choose F-35 for combat, and Canada may not get the same industrial sovereignty. There is no clean exit, but there is a clear lesson. In defense procurement, the aircraft that wins the public argument is not always the aircraft that wins the war planning argument. The Gripen won attention because it spoke to the political mood. The F-35 kept winning inside the military logic because it spoke to the mission. That mission is not small. Canada has to defend massive territory with limited resources. It has to patrol the Arctic. It has to support NORAD. It has to show NATO that it is serious. It has to prepare for a world where Russia, China, and other adversaries are watching Western readiness closely. And it has to do this while rebuilding a defense industrial base that many Canadians feel has been too dependent on foreign suppliers for too long. So when people ask, why did Canada walk away from the Gripen deal after all? The answer is not that Gripen had no value. The answer is that Gripen's value was political, industrial, and financial. The F-35's value was operational, strategic, and network-based. And in a country responsible for the northern defense of an entire continent, operational reality carried more weight. That does not mean the F-35 path is risk-free. It is not. The cost risk is real. The dependence risk is real. The infrastructure risk is real. The pilot shortage risk is real. The political risk of trusting Washington too much is real, but the risk of choosing a fighter that does not match Canada's most demanding missions is also real. And in national defense, the worst mistake is not always spending too much. Sometimes the worst mistake is buying the aircraft that makes voters feel better, but leaves pilots with fewer advantages when the fight begins. That is why Ottawa is hesitating. Not because it cannot see the politics, because it can see both sides too clearly. It can see the national appeal of Gripen. It can see the military pull of F-35. It can see the future promise of GCAP. It can see the danger of delay. And it can see that every month spent reviewing the decision is another month where Canada's aging fighter problem remains unresolved. If you believe the US and Canada deserve honest, clear coverage, not spun headlines, defense industry slogans, or political talking points, this channel was built for you. Subscribe and stand with every viewer who refuses to look away from what is really happening inside the decisions that shape our security, our money, and our future. So the main tension is now clear. Gripen did not lose because it was useless. It lost because Canada's fighter problem was never only about price, jobs, or national pride. It was about whether the aircraft could survive, connect, and fight inside the defense system Canada actually uses. But the next question is more dangerous. If Canada keeps the F-35, can it still escape overdependence on Washington before the next crisis forces the issue? In my next video, I am covering Canada's push toward European and sixth-generation defense partnerships, and what I found will change how you see this.